Next day, far from home, the brothers plan their repulsive crime.
Let us grab him now, do him in, while we got the time.
This they did and made the most of it. Tore his coat and flung him in a pit.
Let us leave him here, all alone, and he's bound to die.
When some Ishmaelites, a hairy crew, came riding by. In a flash, the brothers changed their plan.
We need cash, let's sell him if we can.
Oh, Joseph, what you gonna do? Things look bad for you, hey, what you gonna do? Oh, Joseph, what you gonna do? Things look bad for you, hey, what you gonna do?
Could you use a slave? You hairy bunch of Ishmaelites. Young, strong, well-behaved, going cheap, and he reads and writes.
In a trice, the dirty deal was done. Silver coins for Jacob's favorite son. Then the Ishmaelites galloped off with a slave in tow. Off to Egypt where Joseph was not keen to go. It wouldn't be a picnic, he could tell.
And I don't speak Egyptian very well.
Joseph's brothers tore his precious multicolored coat. Having ripped it up, they next attacked a passing goat. Soon the wretched creature was no more. They dipped his coat in blood and guts and gore. Oh, now, brothers, how low can you stoop? You make a sordid group. Hey, how low can you stoop? Poor Joseph's soul to be a slave. Situation's grave. Hey, soul to be a slave.
Well, after last week, we can imagine Joseph as the annoying, frustrating little brother, his father's favourite son. This morning our attention turns to the sin of his brothers. In verse 14, Jacob sends his favourite out to the fields on a spying mission to see how his brothers were treating the flocks, telling him to bring word back to him. But unbeknown to Jacob, Joseph's life was in danger because their hatred for him had snowballed so much before he even reached them that they were already plotting to kill him. No doubt he stood out in the desert with his amazing technicoloured coat of many colours, adding salt into their wounds. They have a mocking nickname for him, that dreamer, they call him in verse 19. And it wasn't at all affectionate. It was said through gritted teeth. And they plot together to kill him and throw him into a water cistern in the desert. Here we can see the entrance to such a cistern in the Judean desert, and here I am inside, and you can see it would have been an excellent place to hide a dead body. Of course, the brothers would have to lie to cover up their actions and say that some ferocious animal devoured him. Yes, Reuben tried to stop them, but he didn't have sufficient courage to stand up to them directly. Instead, he persuaded them to shove Joseph into that old dry water tank without killing him first, with the idea that he would go back later to rescue him when the others weren't around. Look at verses 21 and 22. But ultimately he showed a lack of conviction. As the oldest brother, he could have told them exactly what to do, but he didn't have the courage to stand up for what he knew to be right. It was a half-hearted and ultimately unsuccessful attempt to change the way things were, because when he returned to the cistern in verse 29, Joseph had already been taken out and sold to the Midianite slave traders. Meanwhile, Joseph's other brothers were showing just how hardened their consciences had become. In verse 23, they stripped Joseph of his lovely coat and they threw him into the empty water cistern. And whilst Joseph was in the pit without food or water, they sat down and ate a meal. I wonder how the mealtime conversation went. Serves him right. He had it coming. I'm not sorry, are you? Then when they saw the Ishmaelites and Medes coming towards them, they saw another opportunity. It was Judah who thought of it first. In verses 26 and 27, he suggests that instead of killing him, they could sell him to the Ishmaelites. They all agreed, and they received their 20 shekels of silver for their little brother. No doubt, that made them feel better. They hadn't killed their kid brother, they just sold him. So that was okay then. After all, they said, he was our brother, our own flesh and blood. The lesser sin seems so much better than the big sin of murder. All of this had snowballed out of control because they hadn't been able to deal with their hatred of Joseph. They had fallen for Satan's lies, hook, line and sinker. With brothers like these, who needs enemies? Not only do they show contempt for Joseph and their father, but they show contempt for God as well. Because they were putting Joseph's dream to the test. They were trying to prove, in fact, that God that was wrong. They wanted to make it absolutely clear that they would never, ever have to bow down to Joseph, despite this clearly being what God had said through Joseph's dream. In verse 20, they plot to kill him. They say, then we'll see what comes of his dreams. They refused to accept that God had had a hand in that dream that foretold their future. They ignored the message and refused to believe it. God doesn't get a look in their thinking. He's ignored. Sin has blinded them to God's truth. These are our ancestors, the forefathers of Israel, and we're no different. Before we knew Jesus, we were just like the brothers, lost in our sin, refusing to accept God's word, standing against God's purpose. It's a sad old story, but it's not the end of the story, because God is using these sinful brothers to prepare for their salvation by suffering the mocking of his brothers, the plot against his life, being sold for a few shekels of silver and being sold into slavery. Joseph would save what would become the 12 tribes of Israel. Instead of starving in the desert of Canaan, they would prosper in Egypt and increase greatly in number. And then God would send Moses to lead them out of Egypt and back to the promised land. Through the snowballing sin of Joseph's brother, God was already preparing for their salvation. But how about us? How are we saved? God needed to send Jesus. He would be mocked by the Jewish leaders. They would plot to kill him, and then one of his closest friends would sell his life in return for a few shekels of silver. And through it all, God was preparing for our salvation. Jesus would be sent to the cross, and there he would give his own life in return for ours. That's how we are saved, by putting our faith and trust in Jesus Christ, Lord of heaven and earth. Just as Joseph's brother, and even their dad, had to put their trust in Joseph, governor of Egypt. Sinners like Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, and you and me need God's help to be saved. But that's exactly what he has prepared for all of us in Jesus. Now we're going to pause there whilst we sing our next song, and then after that song we'll come back for part 2.